Hello, my nightmares. Welcome back. I'm grateful to be back. This video isn't exactly going to be whispered, but it is more so going to be soft-spoken because I need to do a proper cadence to read you a story. I also want to go ahead and put up a little disclaimer. I have coffee. And some people don't like eating or drinking sounds. I apologize. So I'm going to be doing that in this video. I will be taking sips from this here coffee, and I apologize if that bothers you. Now, what we're going to be reading today is this here Hansel and Gretel. This is the Neil Gaiman version, and the artwork was done by Lorenzo Mattotti. And I'm gonna be reading this to you, and I'm gonna pose for a thumbnail. And I'm gonna apologize for not uploading more frequently. I know. Everybody does the apologies and says life gets in the way, but it's the truth. I've been very busy. I've been grieving, mourning my aunt who has passed recently, and I have been working. I work a lot. I work from home, and it catches up with me even though my job is relatively easy. But I'm gonna go ahead and start reading. So our first page here, we've got Hansel and Gretel running through the woods. I also want to apologize if you hear any of the neighbors' sounds, or if you hear my cat in the background, or if my chair squeaks. It's old, I can't help it. I apologize for any outside sounds. I can't control the outside. I apologize. So, I think it adds to the ambience, though, if you think about it that way. So we begin. This all happened a long time ago, in your grandmother's time, or in her grandfather's. A long time ago, back then, we all lived on the edge of the great forest. There was a woodcutter, and he cut down trees, and he chopped the branches off the trees, and he cut the trunks and the branches into logs for firewood, which he would haul on a handcart to the nearest path to town. And it was hungry work, cutting trees. The woodcutter took a pretty young wife, who helped him as best she could, and she cooked for him, and she gave him every comfort. So it was no surprise to them that shortly after they were married, her belly began to swell, and in the winter, when the snows were high, she gave birth to a girl, and this child was called Margaret, which they shortened to Greta, and then to Gretel. 2 years later, the woodcutter's wife gave birth to a boy, and they call him Hans, which, because they could make it no shorter, they made it longer, and they changed it to Hansel. Hansel and Gretel did not go to school, for the schools were too far from the forest where they lived, and the schools cost money, which the woodcutter did not have enough of. For you don't make much money from hewing wood and hauling logs, and even so, their father taught them the way of the woods. Their mother taught them how to cook and to clean and to sew. And if their mother was sometimes bitter and sharp-tongued, and if their father was sometimes sullen and eager to be away from their little home, why, Gretel and Hansel thought nothing of it. As long as they could play in the forest and climb trees and ford rivers, and as long as there was freshly baked bread and eggs and cooked cabbage on their table, When the wood sold well, their father would buy meat for the family at the market, a fat-tailed sheep or a goat, which he would bring back trotting behind his hand-drawn cart, or even a hunk of raw beef, dripping with blood, black with flies or yellow with wasps, and the family would feast that evening. There were rabbits in the forest, and there were ducks in the woodcutter's pond, and there were chickens scratching in the dirt behind the woodcutter's tiny house. There was always food. And here we have a drawing of the cabin in the woods. That was in the good days before the war, before the famine. War came, and the soldiers came with it, hungry, angry, and bored. Scared men as they passed through and stole the cabbages and the chickens and the ducks, and the woodcutter's family was never certain who was fighting whom, nor why they were fighting, nor what they were fighting about. But beyond the forest, the fields of crops were burned, and barley fields became battlefields, and the farmers were killed or made into soldiers in their turn and marched away. As soon as enough, the miller had no grain to mill into flour, and the butcher had no animals to kill and hang in his window. And they said you could name your price for a fat rabbit. Soon enough, the root vegetables rotted in the fields, all the turnips and carrots and potatoes. There were fewer and fewer people to dig them up. And it rained, so that only things to eat their fill in those fields were the slugs. And the woodcutter's cottage was far from the battles, and the woodcutter and his wife and Gretel and Hansel all felt the war's effect. They ate soup made from old cabbage leaves, into which the children would dip their stale bread, now hard as stone. And the family went to bed hungry, and they woke up hungrier. The children, they slept on straw pallets, and their parents slept in an ancient bed that once belonged to the woodcutter's grandmother. Hansel woke in the night, a sharp, empty pain in his stomach, but he did not say anything, for he knew there was little enough to eat, and he kept his eyes closed, and he tried to return to sleep, and when he slept, he was not hungry. He could hear his parents talking in the darkness. There are 4 of us, his mother was saying, 4 mouths to feed, and if we keep going like this, we'll all die. Without the extra mouths, you and I will have a chance. We cannot, replied the woodcutter in a whisper. It would be a monstrous thing to do, to kill our children, and I will have no part of it. Lose them, not kill them, said the woodcutter's wife. And here we have a picture of Hansel and Gretel in the bed of their cabin. Nobody said anything about killing anybody. We'll take them deep into the forest and lose them. They'll be fine. Perhaps a kind person will take them in and feed them, and we can always have more children. She added practically. A bear might eat them, said the woodcutter dejectedly. We cannot do this thing. If we do not eat, said his wife, then you will not be able to swing the axe, and if you cannot cut down a tree or haul the wood into town, then we all will starve and die. 2 dead are better than 4 dead. That's mathematics, and it is logic. I care for neither your mathematics nor logic, grumbled the woodcutter, but I can argue no more. And Hansel heard only silence from his parents' bed. Gretel woke Hansel the next morning. It's going to be a good day, she said. Our father is going to take us into the forest with him, and he will teach us to cut wood. Their father would not ordinarily take them with him deep into the forest. He said it was too dangerous for children. Hansel went down to the little stream that splashed and sang behind their cottage, and he filled his pockets with the tiny white stones that lined the stream bed. "Why are you doing that?" asked Gretel. Hansel looked up and saw his parents standing by the doorway, and he said nothing to his sister. Their father took them into the forest, and each turn they took, Hansel quietly dropped a little white stone to mark the change of direction. Their father told them to wait for him in the grove of birch trees, and their trunks were paper white against the darkness of the forest. He built them a small fire to keep them warm. He gave them his lunch to keep them from hunger, stale black bread and hard cheese. He would look for them soon, he said, and they waited. "He is never coming back," said Hansel. And here we have Hansel and Gretel in the forest with the fire, waiting. "He is our father," said Gretel. "You must not say such things about him." The day waned and twilight fell, and the shadows crept out from beneath each tree and puddled and pooled until the world was one huge shadow. "He's not coming back for us," said Hansel. "We must wait," said Gretel. "Perhaps he's delayed." She gathered a pile of leaves, and the two children made themselves as comfortable as they could beside the crackling fire. They awoke in the small hours of the night, when the fire was only embers and the moon was full, and in the moon's light Hansel found it easy to retrace his steps, and the white stones from the stream were perfectly visible even in the darkness. Hansel and Gretel held hands as they walked, and it was almost dawn when they returned to the cottage, and their father's face was crimson, and his eyes were red and wet, as if he had been crying and drinking. And when he saw them, he jumped up. "It is Hansel," he exclaimed, "and it is Gretel. We thought you were lost in the forest. But look, wife, look at them. Our children are here." And their mother's face was pale, and her lips thin, and as she watched them, she said nothing. And the woodcutter hugged tightly to them, and he cried, and he laughed, and he cried, and he laughed once more, and he gave the children each a swollen cherry soaked in syrup from a jar that had once been filled with them and was now almost empty, to show them both how pleased he was that they were home. And their mother looked hungrily at the last 4 cherries in the jar, and the children sucked on the cherries as long as they could, making them last before they swallowed them. The children stayed in the house for another week, and a week after that, and nothing was said about the time they were lost in the forest, and they found their way home again. Hansel would lie there in the night awake, listening to the darkness, but he heard nothing but snores and rustles. And then, one morning, their father announced he was taking them to work with him. And here, the father is taking the kids through the forest. Hansel was not prepared, and there was no time to go to the stream, no time to fill his pockets with white stones, and their mother had been up early, baking the last of the flour as they made ready to walk into the forest. She came over to them, 2 small loaves of white bread in her apron, soft and hot from the oven. The children followed their father deep into the forest, past the trees that tangled together like clutching hands with fingers that scraped and scrapped. And Hansel had no pebbles, but he made little balls of bread between his fingers and dropped them in each intersection, and each time they changed direction to mark the way. They reached a river, and their father showed them where to ford it. Where the river was shallow and the rocks stuck up from the water, they took off their shoes, and they carried them until they reached the far bank, where the trees were thick and old and gnarled into shapes that looked like angry giants, frozen in time. They were so deep into the old forest that the sunlight was stained green by the leaves, and they pushed through the brambles and thorns that tugged at their clothes as if to say, "Stay here, stay here." But they plunged deeper and deeper into the forest. And finally their father said, "Wait here for me, and I'll be back for you." But he turned and he walked away, and they heard him pushing through the thicket, and then they heard nothing more. "He's not coming back for us," said Gretel. "No," Hansel agreed. They were so hungry, Gretel divided her little loaf into two, and she shared it with her brother. The daylight began to fade, and they talked about what they could do, where they could go, and the only place they knew was their home. And here we have Hansel and Gretel going through the forest. At the first place where Hansel remembered that he had dropped a little bread ball, they stopped, and he looked on the ground to see which way that they should go, but the bread ball was gone. "I think we came this way," said Gretel, but she was not certain. "They went that way, and at the bottom of this hill," said Hansel, "I left another bread ball." But there was nothing at the bottom of the hill, only a wood pigeon pecking at the remaining crumbs of bread, and it flew off when it saw the children. "The creatures of the forest were hungry too," said Gretel. Hansel said nothing. He knew that he could not find his way back without his clues. One tree, one hill, one gnarled root, one stream, and they all very much look like one another. They walked until it grew too dark to see, and they slept beneath the huge old oak tree, in a bed they made of mounded up leaves, and they were cold and sad and scared of bears and wolves and other things in the forest that might eat children. Morning came. "I am cold and I am hungry," said Hansel, and Gretel hugged her brother tightly. "We must go home," said Gretel. "Our parents will be worried about us," and Hansel did not reply. He had smelled something in the morning air, something as sweet and as warm and as wholesome and heartening as gingerbread. He told his sister, "I smell gingerbread. You smell nothing. Sniff the air," said Hansel. And she sniffed freshly baked gingerbread. Now even Gretel could smell it, and her mouth watered. See, I lost my spot. Her mouth watered, and her stomach began to hurt, as if it had just remembered that it was there. And they walked towards the smell, honey cake and ginger and spices, a glorious sweetness that stole over them. And now the children ran toward the source of the smell, impelled by hunger, going in a direction they had never seen before, until, in the clearing, they saw a tiny house, even smaller than their own. And here is the tiny house, and here are the children in the forest. Coffee break. "Someone in that house must be baking," said Gretel. But she was wrong. The smell came from the house itself. It was made of fresh gingerbread and decorated with hard sugar and candies of green and red, and even the windows were clear panes of barely sugar. Hansel reached out and broke off a window ledge, and Gretel hesitated, but when she saw her brother eating and smiling, she pulled off a shingle from the wall, and they ate together, letting the spicy gingerbread fill their mouths, their heads, their stomachs. A voice from inside, gentle and amused. "Who nibbles my house? Is it a mouse?" Hansel and Gretel said nothing, for they were scared, and their mouths were full, and they were relieved when the person who came out of the house was not an ogre or a monster, but a kindly-faced old woman, leaning on a stick, who peered about her short-sightedly with dim eyes. "Why, you're children," she said. "You must be so hungry, children, to eat my house like that. Come inside, and let me feed you." There was only one room in the little house, with a huge brick oven at one end, and a table laden with all good things, candied fruits, cakes, pies, cookies, breads with biscuits. But there was no meat, though, and the old woman apologized, explaining that she was old, and her eyes were not what they had once been when she was young, and she was no longer up to catching the beast of the forest, as she had once been. And now she told the children she baited her snare, and she waited. And often no game would come into her trap from one year to another, and what she did catch was too scrawny to eat and needed to be fattened up first. "Still," she said, "you children give me hope, and I think it is lucky that you have come, and perhaps now there will be meat once again." The children told her of the mother and their father, and how they had been taken into the forest and abandoned. And the old woman, tutted and chuckled and shook her head. "Whatever is the world coming to?" she said sadly. And here you see them speaking with the woman in the cottage. She showed the children to their little beds, the sheets so white and crisp and the pillows so soft, and they slept as deeply and as soundly as if their food had been drugged, and it had. The old woman was stronger than she looked. A sinewy, gristly strength, she picked Hansel up and carried the sleeping boy to the empty stable at the rear of the house, where there was a large metal cage with rusty bars. And she dropped him onto the straw, for there was only straw on the floor, along with a few ancient and well-chewed bones. And she locked the cage, and she felt her way along the wall, back to her house. "Meat," she said happily. And Gretel awoke in the dark corner of the cottage on the floor. The little beds had been removed, as had the uneaten food that had been left on the table. She was tied to the table leg by a long chain, and there was nothing sweet about the old woman. Not any longer. She made Gretel clean and work for her, and if the girl did not obey her fast enough, she would beat her and call her all manner of evil names. And each day the old woman would hobble out to the stable, and she would go to the bars of the cage, and she would tell Hansel to hold out a finger for her to feel, so she could see if he was fattening up to her liking. And she fed him cake, and she fed him potatoes and candied fruit. She fed him puddings of all kinds, and fools and gruels and crumbles and cobblers, and she would stand beside the cage as he ate, listening to make sure he swallowed every crumb and licked every bowl clean. And she would poke at him with her stick if he dared to complain that he was full, and that he could not choke down another mouthful. And Gretel, chained in the house, could not see her brother, She could only hope that he was all right, and sometimes, when she returned from visiting Hansel, the old woman would be in good spirits, and she would tell Gretel that if she would take care of her and protect her as she grew into a woman, she would teach the girl all her secrets, teach her to call the birds down from the trees, teach her to ensnare travelers. And here you see the old woman, and here's Gretel by the fireplace. To make sure that anyone who came to the cottage would never leave. But an hour later, she would be scolding Gretel, telling her that she was good for nothing at all. Now, as day followed day, the old woman would return from visiting Hansel in even worsening humor. In truth, Hansel grew fat, but the old woman was too blind to see it. Each day she reached for his finger, but instead he would hold out a bone, and he had found in the straw. And she felt the bone, and thinking it was the boy's finger, left him for another day, and her patience, however, was not inexhaustible. One morning, a month or more after the children had been captured, the old woman returned from visiting Hansel and told Gretel to light a fire in the brick oven. "Today, when the oven is hot enough, we will roast your brother," said the old woman, "but do not be sad. I will give you his bones to chew, little one." And Gretel shrugged. She hardly spoke to the old woman, not a word or two if she had to. The old woman had begun to suspect the little girl was more than a half-wit. Gretel did as she was told, and she lit the wood in the oven and watched the branches flare and burn, and she closed the door to the oven, and inside the wood was burning. Soon it would collapse to glowing embers. "See if it's hot enough to roast your brother yet," said the old woman. "Climb inside and tell me." "I don't know how," said Gretel. She stood where she was, making no move to even open the door. "It's easy. Simply open the door and lean in and feel if it's hot enough yet to roast your flesh." "I don't know how," said Gretel again. "You're a slattern and a dolt," exclaimed the old woman. "Idiot child, I will show you how." The old woman hobbled over to the oven, leaning on her stick. "Learn from me." The old woman opened the oven door. And here we see the old woman being pushed into the fire by Hansel. Or Gretel, sorry. We all make mistakes. Gretel had learned more from her than the old woman suspected, and the girl pushed the old woman forward, hard and sudden, making her topple all the way into the oven, and the girl closed the door and held it closed and listened while the old woman's screams died away. Gretel stared at the oven door, scared that the old woman would somehow survive and that she would open the door and come after her, but nothing happened. Gretel stared at the oven door. I read that already. Gretel found the old woman's keys hidden beneath her pillow. She unlocked the chain, and then she went out to the stable. "The old woman is dead," Gretel told her brother as she let him out of the cage. "I killed her." She helped him out of the cage and into the daylight, marveling at the plump young man her brother had transformed into, wondering about his refusal to let go of the bone he held as firmly as if his life may have depended on it. They clung to each other tightly in the sunshine, the brother and the sister, and the kitchen smelled of burning flesh, but when the oven cooled and they opened the door, there was nothing inside but a blackened husk, now crisp and turned to carbon, and a small iron key. The key opened a chest beneath the woman's bed, in which the two children found all manner of things, gloves and hats of travelers, and coins of gold and silver, a string of pearls, chains of gold and silver, and rings set with diamonds and rings set with rubies, all the treasures of the people who had visited the old woman's cottage over the years, who had never left. And there were rich clothes, too, clothes of silks and satins trimmed with lace and gold and brocade, clothes for men and fine dresses for women. The children put on the garments from the chest, for their own clothes were rags, and they filled a sack with coins and jewelry and precious stones, and they left that place without ever looking back. The children walked south until they came to a river. They forded the river where it was shallow. And here they are, crossing the river. They recognized the familiar places where they had played and the trees they had climbed, and they walked a path they knew all their lives. And they found themselves in front of the little house in which they had been born, and they called out, not daring to come close. And the woodcutter ran to meet them, and he threw down his axe and embraced them, holding them tightly. He told them he had not been happy for a single day since the children had gone, and he had not once slept through the night. And each day he had searched for them in the forest, and each day he had failed to find them. And our mother? Asked Hansel, where's our mother? We brought precious stones and all manner of riches, and now our mother can eat whatever she wants and live wherever she wants, and she will not have to be afraid that we will all starve. The woodcutter said nothing, but he showed them to the grave in the garden that he had dug himself for their mother. And she had died soon after the children had gone, whether of something eating her away inside, or from hunger, or from anger, or loss of her children, no one could say. Hansel and Gretel and their father and the woodcutter had lived happily in the little house for years to come, and the treasures they had brought from the old woman's cottage kept them comfortable, and there were no more empty plates in all of their lives. And in the years that followed, Hansel and Gretel each married, and married well, and the people who went to their weddings ate such fine food that their belts burst from the fat from the meat ran down their chins, and while the pale moon looked down kindly to them all. The end. And here we have the woodcutter reuniting with Hansel and Gretel in the cottage. And that is Hansel and Gretel. I hope you enjoyed the story. I'm probably going to film a couple videos today. I haven't been quite certain which direction I want to take this channel. I've had some people ask me to play my steel ton drum, and I think I want to eventually do both ASMR videos, but I'd also like to do vlogs eventually and just show you guys what my life is like from day to day and show you some of my favorite things, some of my hobbies, show you my artwork and my ventures as a person and a personality, I guess. I want to say that I'm planning on making a schedule for my videos, but I don't see that in my future as of right now. This is probably one of the longest videos I have filmed for this channel so far. But I'd like to know what you guys would like to see for content going forward. Do you like my ASMR? Would you like to see unboxings? Would you like to see ASMR unboxings? Would you like to see outfit of the day videos, vlogs, just nonsense? Let me know. But anyways, I appreciate you all for being here, and I'm so glad you were able to spend some time with me while I read you a story. While it might not have been read perfectly, I still am happy that I got to read to you. I love you all with all of my person. and I will see you in the next video.